to help us in that regard. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Gregg Walker.
I am going to make you endure 2 talks tonight. And the first one is a short one, and then we get to the long one. This first one is 38 years at Oregon State University, fun facts. And I want to tell you, I purposely dressed for the occasion. I knew you wouldn't respect me as much if I had a coat and tie on. You'd respect me more if I was in beaver ears. And so, well, I'll take my hat off, though, for that. I have been blessed to be here for 38 years. Came here as a mid-30s assistant professor from the University of Utah. Took a pay cut to come to Oregon State. As I look around at my faculty friends, I think many of us could say we've done that. But I didn't come here because I was going to get rich on some high salary. I came here because I had a sense that Oregon State was a very special place. And it truly is. My wife would say, you've never held a job anywhere more than 5 years, and now we've been here 38. And it's because Oregon State truly is a remarkable place, and I'll talk about that. But let's look at the fun facts. So, what have I done at Oregon State? Here's some interesting numbers. I've taught 32 different courses. Not classes, different courses. 23 undergraduate courses and 9 graduate courses. Com 114, a course that I created in 1989 and has been directed by a number of people. Dr. Goodnow, for example, and myself have directed it. 23,000 students have taken this class. That is more than any other university in the country when it comes to a class in argument and critical thinking. And I'm guessing in here, how many of us are currently in 114 or have taken 114? Good. And how many are getting extra credit for being here tonight? All right. And Com 440, a course that I inherited, Theories of Conflict and Conflict Management. Oh, there's a typo. All of my students know Walker never can show slides without a typo. Since 1988, over 1,000 students have taken this class. And those are things that I feel really good about. That conflict management, argument. Well, let's go to some more, though. I've served on more than 150 graduate committees. I've supervised more than 40. Created 6 new catalog courses and 6 topic-specific graduate courses. And I have read or graded more than 28,000 papers and essay exams. Oh my God, that makes me feel old and tired at the same time. And I've written hundreds of letters of recommendation, and I've done so willingly. That's such a fun part of the job. I've worked with terrific students. I couldn't say enough about Oregon State students. I've met so many of you over the years, and have been so impressed with who you are as people, even if you maybe didn't ace my class. I've worked with wonderful colleagues. You know, there are some departments around the country where the faculty members don't get along. They pick sides. It's this specialty against that specialty. That's never happened in my career. We like each other, we respect each other, we support each other. Great group of people, faculty and staff. And I've been fortunate to be supervised by excellent supervisors or bosses, including Dr. Hesse, who introduced me. Very grateful to the wonderful people who I've been able to work for. I've been able to be the kind of professor I wanted to be, which is a pracademic. Oregon State has supported me working off campus internationally as well as domestically, being able to advance ideas that we've been able to cultivate here on campus, but it is both a practitioner and academic combination. I've collaborated with students and colleagues both within communication and across the university, and I want to do a shout out to one of my best friends and colleagues, Steve Daniels, who's come all the way from Montana to be here. And we have and I've said this before, if Steve had not called me in 1991 and said, I'm a new assistant professor in the College of Forestry, can I come to your conflict management class and hang out and sit in? I said, of course you can. And as class ended, he said, let's go out for a beer. And he said, what's your interest in environmental issues? I said, well, it's one of the reasons I want to live in Oregon, but I don't have the expertise on the environment. He said, well, I do, but you know conflict. We're still working together. And again, that kind of thing doesn't happen everywhere. I hope it happens to you in your lifetime. But most importantly, I've been supported by amazing family who are sitting over here. My wife, Jane, my oldest son, Kyle, who's a professor at at TCU, Texas Christian University. My youngest son, Travis, who's here, and he is, now Travis, am I get this right? Senior Business Specialist at Pacific Corps. So if you want to learn about the Horned Frogs, you talk to Kyle. If you want to learn about your utility bill, you talk to Travis. Is that fair statement? And I also want to do a shout out. I want to do a shout out to my wife Jane, who taught for 20 years at Lynn Benton Community College and is the best teacher in our family. With that in mind, we're going to get to the talk tonight, which is called Just Transition and the Human Dimensions of Climate Change. But I want to show you that in another life I was a famous baseball player. Well, not really, but if he only had spelled his name right, it would have been a lot better. So let me get to the second set of slides. Now, this is for you in 114. 114 students, do you have to write a short paper?
Yes.
Yeah, right. And have we had the lecture yet on credibility and evidence?
Yes.
All right, there we go. So this slide is for you. Because the thing that you might think is Walker, a communication professor, qualified to talk about climate change? On the surface, you might think, what does a communication professor have to do with climate change? Well, you'll find out in a little bit. Here are some things about me designed to establish my credibility for all of you in 114 who have to write that paper. So I've taught a course on international negotiation here since 1989. And a little aside, when I developed the course, I was skeptical about the extent to which Oregon State University students would be able to embrace international conflict and negotiation. I have been so impressed after all these years. How well students engaged that class, how much they got into it, how much they learned from it, and I learned with them from it as well. I followed UN climate change negotiations since 1997 and brought in discussions of the UN process to that class. I participated in UN climate change meetings since 2009, over 50 of them, been to Germany 30 times, and have participated in the last 15 conferences of the party. So I was in Baku last November, and I was in Dubai the year before that, and Sharm el-Sheikh the year before that, and Glasgow, and on and on and on. I've given climate change communication and policy talks at conferences and meetings on every continent except Antarctica. And yes, I'm going to anticipate your question, am I feeling guilty about my carbon footprint? And my answer is yes. But I'll tell you later how I deal with that. I lead 2 observer teams at UN meetings. One is Mediators Beyond Borders International. The other one is the International Environmental Communication Association. I'm a pro bono advisor to the UNFCCC's Capacity Building Committee, which is called the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. And I'm a regular observer at meetings of the Adaptation Committee. So I've been heavily involved with the UN process, and it means that I've spent a lot of time studying climate change, studying the climate crisis, if you will. But I'm going to make no claims as a climate scientist. You're going to hear me speak as a climate social scientist. Now, I'm going to ask this question, and the old folks in this room like me might know what this is. What is this? Anybody know what this is?
A wigwam burner.
A wigwam burner, absolutely. Tell us what a wigwam burner does.
Burns hog fuel.
Yeah, and do we see many of them anymore? No, this is a wigwam burner. If you would have traveled through Montana, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, back 30, 40 years ago, in little bitty towns like Kamiah, Idaho, Sweet Home, Oregon, you would see, or Eureka, I think the first one I ever saw was Eureka, Montana, you'd see a wigwam burner. Why don't we see wigwam burners today? Because the forest products industry has changed, and they're not useful anymore. Now, let me ask you this one. Oh, going the wrong way. I thought I was. Now there we go. We're going to go maybe this is, there we go. See. Oh, now, where is this? Take a look at that picture. Somebody tell me where that is. Where is that? Oh, come on. People should know this right away. Hey, nobody knows.
Baker City.
Now, that's a good guess. It is Eastern Oregon.
Oregon.
It is Oregon. You got that right.
Joseph!
It's the town of Joseph, Oregon. How many of us have been to Joseph? Yeah, and what is it about Joseph that's different today from 40 years ago? It's the timber industry isn't there like it used to be. But what is there? Metal sculpture. It's become known worldwide for metal sculpture. It's an example of a town that changed, that in fact reinvented itself. Now, the wigwam burner in Joseph, Oregon illustrate the concept of transition, adaptation, and resilience. And I want to focus on this idea of transition. Now, the word transition may be pretty obvious to all of us. I'm going to ask the students in here right now, can any of you tell me on a personal level, can you think of a personal transition that any of you have made? Anybody who's, yes, go ahead.
Going to college.
Going to college, exactly right. $20 to this gentleman. You got it. Absolutely right. One of the biggest and most significant transitions in our lives is leaving home and going away to the military, or going away to college, or going away to work. And for everybody in this room, the likelihood is you've experienced that personal transition. So we're used to the word transition. It's not a bad word. It's a word that in fact reflects what we do. What about professionally? Now I'm going to ask the older folks in this room, not the college students. Can anybody give me an example of a professional transition?
Retirement.
Retirement is one. Yeah, there we go. Retirement is a good example of a professional transition. What is another one that we experienced, those of us who are faculty, when we were probably in our 30s or 20s? And that is? Yeah, getting hired, getting a job. So we know the word transition. Now there's organizational changes, there are community changes, there are societal changes, and it's also interesting to note that transitions can be proactive or reactive. A proactive is a transition you anticipate. I chose to leave the University of Utah to come to Oregon State University in 1987, to take a pay cut to come here, to meet with the president of the University of Utah who tried to talk me out of leaving to come to Oregon State, and I've always been so grateful Oregon State offered me the job. That was a proactive transition, where I chose to in fact accept the position at Oregon State. We all know there are reactive transitions, where we have to deal with a crisis or a transition or a change that's forced upon us. And sadly, for our friends in Southern California dealing with these horrific wildfires, that is a transition that is imposed on them. It's a reactive transition. But I want to talk about that in the context of climate change. If I get my clicker to work properly, there we go. I want to talk about the term just transition. Now this term, if you go back and you look at the climate negotiations that occurred in 1995, 1997, this was not talked about at all. But the concept of just transition means that we combine the idea of change with a notion of social justice. We think about a kind of change that is fair, that is equitable, that it supports what people are going through. And so you can see that from the World Resources Institute, a number of things. I'm not going to read all the slides, but you can say meaningful dialogue, affected workers, revenue streams, organizations taking positive action. So the town of Joseph transitions. Sweet Home, Oregon has struggled some to transition away from the timber industry. Some towns have handled it much better than others. Some countries have to go through difficult transitions given some of the catastrophic weather events that they experience. Now, if we think about just transition a little further, if I get my slide to work here, there we go. This is from the Sierra Club, and the idea is that it's a principle, a process, and a practice. And the key part that I like about this is that the people who are most affected by change should have a voice in that change. And so we think about transitions related to adaptation, adapting to changes in climate, and building resilience in organizations and communities and societies and countries. There we go. This is from the Sierra Club, and the idea is that it's a principle, a process, and a practice. And the key part that I like about this is that the people who are most affected by change should have a voice in that change. And so we think about transitions related to adaptation, adapting to changes in climate, and building resilience in organizations and communities and societies and countries. So you can see we'll get this to work someday. There we go. So climate justice and just transition, think about it this way. We need to transition economically. If we're going to address the climate crisis in a significant way, and in a way that will be important to all of us in this room, regardless of our age, we need to also transition culturally, restoratively, and procedurally. So transitioning involves a number of different aspects, as you can see in that slide. And then what about the climate situation? People, when I give these talks, and I've given, not this exact talk, but similar talks on other campuses, they say, what about climate science? What I think is interesting is I'm just going to give you a bunch of headlines. And these you can read on your own, and you can see that all of these are relatively recent. Like the last one, Hawaiian Observatory clocks the highest annual jump in atmospheric carbon dioxide since records began 67 years ago. And the other one up top, 2024, was the hottest year on record. And you can see all of those headlines that appear in the popular press. And what that basically suggests is that we need to pay attention to climate science. And for those of you who are studying this, look at IPCC reports. Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In particular, I always recommend to people, read the summaries for policymakers. You don't have to read the entire document, but read the summary for policymakers, because that's where I think we need to put our energy, is in changing climate policy. You can see that the first IPCC report actually came out in 1990, and the 7th one will come out, I think, in another year. And a number of Oregon State University climate scientists have helped write sections of these IPCC reports. But I want to talk about climate as a social science, and note to you that it's gained limited attention within the climate science community. If you look at the IPCC reports over time, you will see that they increasingly address social science issues, although still not nearly as much attention paid to that as trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's significant within the NGO and academic communities, and it's also very important to developing countries. I had the good fortune in 2017 to be invited to a climate change conference in Bangladesh, and it was at Independent University of Bangladesh in Dhaka, and the focus there was on adaptation. The focus there was on climate resilience. The focus there was, in fact, on just transition. And it's also essential to climate policy and action, and it's where a lot of our ideas matter. We don't have to be climate scientists to be able to be climate activists, and you'll see that again. So what I want to do, and I'm going to do it with pictures instead of a lot of bullets, I want to highlight 8 what I call human dimensions that we need to pay attention to in this climate crisis. And you can see the list here. Let's start with culture. Culture is in part related to the next slide, which is indigenous knowledge. But the real point here is we have to understand the cultural traditions that exist in order to be able to advance climate change. A good example of that would be in some parts of the world, in rural areas adjacent to forests, people have for generations gone into the forest to collect firewood. And that, of course, has an effect on those forests. It's degrading. It can affect deforestation. It can affect a forest as a good climate sink. So there are nonprofits that say, let's come up with easy to use, kind of light technology propane stoves for cooking. Well, you just can't go into a village and say, here we've got a bunch of propane stoves, now you can all cook on these. You don't have to go into the woods anymore. You've got to do that in a way that respects the cultural traditions and trains people to make sure they're comfortable with that technology. And there are lots of stories like that. Then there's indigenous knowledge, and of course that's a critical aspect as well, where we need to provide opportunities for indigenous voices to be heard. If you've traveled, as I have, a little bit in Finland and Sweden, you encounter the Sami population, the Sami community. They know more about reindeer than probably any wildlife biologist that comes out of a university in Sweden or Finland. And to tap into their knowledge of habitats that are important and in fact, ways in which the reindeer migrate would be important to try to manage those herds even as snow conditions change. And then there's gender. When I started going to the UN climate meetings in 2009, gender was not really a part of the conversation. But something that I've said in talks, and I usually get a head nod, you can give me a head nod if you want, is that if you think about this globally, at the local level, at the village level, at the neighborhood level, who's likely to be the most important agent of change? Is it a woman or is it a man? Does it relate to gender? And the answer is typically yes. So we need to empower people at the local level to be leaders. And Mediators Beyond Borders, for example, has a program where we've worked in developing countries to invite women to improve their leadership skills, knowing that they're going to be working on matters related to sustainable development and climate change. Now, there's also the importance of youth. And when I go to these UN climate conferences, I'm always impressed with the thousands of young people who are there from all over the world. And when they go to these conferences, they are listened to. The youth voices at these UN climate meetings are more significant than the voices of the baby boomer generation that I'm a part of. So how do we in fact involve youth and pay attention to the priorities of young people when it comes to the climate crisis? We have to be able to do that. There's also, of course, the idea of collaboration. Now, I referred to my great friend and colleague Steve Daniels. We started working on collaborative ideas years ago, wrote a book on it, developed a methodology called collaborative learning. And when I go to these conferences, there's tremendous talk about how do we get people to work together across countries, across organizations, across scales, across issues. And the idea that collaboration and conflict resolution and peace building needs to be built into the kind of climate actions that we take. Then there's this issue of communication. Now, I'm a communication professor. I couldn't pass up on a slide that says communication. But on a more serious note, the idea of outreach and engagement. And the word engagement is really important because it's an empowering term. It doesn't mean that you and I are passive and someone talks at us about the climate crisis. It's that people engage us in dialogue, in deliberation, in conversation, in peer learning around these issues. And then, of course, education relates directly to that as well. We think about how do we, in fact, educate a community. Now, I tell a story here, and you have to, those of you who've been in classes with me know Walker is a storyteller. I'm not sure how good I am at it, but you have to bear with me. A story that I've told a number of times is a number of years ago, I was working in, this is about 8 years ago, I'm working in Pinedale, Wyoming, Sublette County, Wyoming. I'm helping start a community-based forest collaborative. There was no collaborative group at that time in that part. If you know where that is, it's at the southern end of it's on the southeast of the Grand Teton National Park and that whole area of Bridger Teton National Forest. I was having breakfast with a county commissioner who was also a rancher. Now, he was about 15 years older than me, very healthy. And I just having a conversation. He knows I'm from Oregon State University. He assumes I'm a liberal professor. And I said to him, tell me about your ranch that you've been on for multiple generations. I said, what are the problems that you're facing? He said, well, we're not getting enough rain. The snowpack isn't as good as it used to be. There's a lot of beetle kill in the forest. We're having to graze our cattle on federal lands higher up the hillside to find good grasses. He went through a whole list of things. And I said to him, how much do you think relates to the changes in climate? And he looked at me and said, you got me. And I did, because I started with what he knew, his local knowledge. But I also talked about education and ways to educate that relates the climate crisis to the quality of people's lives, to their health, to their livelihoods. It doesn't mean we don't educate about climate science. I don't want to diminish the importance of that. But we know that for some people, that's not where their interests are. Their interests are in pursuing their careers, supporting their families, keeping their towns going strong. And then lastly, where Steve Daniels and I have put a lot of our work over the years is participatory governance. How do you, in fact, engage people in participation that's meaningful? I've more recently been talking with some people in both Pakistan and Uzbekistan who are interested in some of the work that Steve and I have done over the years, as well as the work that Aaron Wolf done. Aaron in the back of the room, Todd Jarvis, who's here as well, a number of us who work in this area. And one of the things they're interested in is participatory governance. And you might say, can participatory governance work in countries that are not democracies the way we think we are? And the answer is yes. And when I looked at, for example, the NEPA equivalent, the National Environmental Policy Act equivalent of Pakistan, there's a provision in there for public participation. So participatory governance means we can find ways to get communities involved in their future, their climate futures. Now this leads to this slide, locally led adaptation. In the world of climate policy that I work, this has become a very powerful driver in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but locally led adaptation, you can see, is supported by a number of organizations, including the World Resource Institute and the Global Commission on Adaptation, which is funded in part by Bill Gates and is based out of the Netherlands. But if you look at the first one, devolving decision-making at the lowest level, that's participatory governance. It's collaboration. Below that, addressing structural inequalities faced by women, youth, children, disabled, displaced. That's where, again, once again, you're bringing in indigenous voices, you're bringing in the voices of youth. You can see in all of that. And then if we take a look at this, you can see that these LLA principles relate to these 8 human dimensions that I've mentioned. And you can, again, see that in this slide. But what about the negotiations? When I've given talks like this before, people often ask me, well, what's happening in negotiations? And the meeting in Baku, there have been a lot of articles about how Baku did not accomplish very much because its focus was on climate finance, and a number of developed countries like the US didn't put up as much money as developing countries had hoped. And we can certainly chat about that. But what I want to point out is that just transition, this concept I've been talking about, is not there in the 90s. There's some attention in the 2000s. It's very prominent now, very important to implementing policy and taking climate action. Now again, to give you a sense of just transition and all of these human dimensions, my good friend Steve worked on the Northwest Forest Plan. Steve, how many years ago was that? Mid-1990s. And President Clinton had been elected in his first term. And Steve was part of a social science team working on that. And they may not have used the term just transition, but they would look at a community like Sweet Home, or they'd look at Redding, California, or they'd look at Cave Junction, Oregon, or Prineville, and they'd say, how do we transition these communities away from a dependence on timber off of federal lands? That's a critical issue. And it's not just giving people money to go to the community college when you're 60 years old to get trained to be an electrician. It has to be much more substantial than that. It has to involve local communities talking about how do we transition as a community, how do we transition as people to a new energy economy, if you will. Now what I've done in these last slides is given you some ideas. What are ways that we can become engaged? We have the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition. I've talked about the Sustainability Coalition to people all over the country and even internationally, because what's happening here in Corvallis is really, really impressive, where people are coming together to work on issues related to housing, transportation, land use, and of course the Sustainability Coalition will have a town hall sometime in March. And if any of you know the exact date, holler it out for us. I know it's set for, I think, around the middle of March here on campus. We typically have held it even in this building. But a lot of things that you can do to get involved, and you can see I have examples in the photos. And you can do that as informed educators. And one area is the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. I went through this training. It's free. It's founded by former Vice President Al Gore. Inconvenient Truth. You probably know who I'm talking about. And you can go through a climate leadership training where you become a really good climate change communicator. And a number of my students have done it. I think, Aiden, didn't you go through it this last year? And so Aiden and I are both climate reality leaders. I don't know if you knew that we both are, but that's a cool thing. And Aiden's a very talented instructor that some of the 114 students probably have. So encourage you to think about that. And as agents of change, and again, if you think about that, ways that you can get involved in that might include, for some of you, actually participating in the United Nations Framework Convention process. A number of students have done that. Lexi is right here in the front, and you were in Bonn, Germany as a representative, I think, of International Environmental Communication Association. So we have people from Oregon State who've been on the teams that I lead to these conferences. Now, all I'm showing you in these slides is simply that look in your hometown or your home county or your home state and Google their climate action plans and see if they address human dimensions. See if they address just transition. I'm pulling up here Phoenix, Arizona, Mesa, Arizona, Tucson, Arizona, City of Portland, Las Vegas or Clark County, Nevada. And what you'll discover is there's very, very limited attention. There's a lot of discussion about electric buses. There's a lot of discussion about solar panels on government buildings. But there's not much discussion about just transition. There's not much discussion about gender, about youth, about collaboration, about participatory governance, about those very indigenous knowledge, those topics that I brought up. So I want to end here this way. When I was an undergraduate, this is going to make me sound like an old person or a grandparent, and I am kind of both. I remember when I was a college student at the University of Minnesota, and in 1970, I'm just starting college, I decided I needed to be an activist. I needed to do something. And the Vietnam War was going on, and a lot of my friends were protesting the Vietnam War. I spoke Spanish pretty well back then. I had a job one summer where I sadly got to see migrant farm camps in Michigan, and I decided to work with United Farm Workers. At that time, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta were working with people in Central California to unionize farm labor. I joined the Minneapolis St. Paul group. I got to meet Cesar Chavez. He is one of my heroes, and I will encourage you as you think about your future and your activism on whatever issue matters to you, that you find those role models, you find those heroes who might influence you and guide you. And for me, it was Cesar Chavez, and I had the good fortune to meet him when I was 20 years old. And so I stood in front of the equivalent of Safeway grocery stores, giving out leaflets telling people, don't buy lettuce and don't buy grapes unless it has a union label. And yes, I got called a communist, including my own aunt calling me a communist. Now again, you have some information on them here, and then I put in these slides. I have here a little bit more about Huerta and Chavez, and you can see they took great risks, and sometimes we have to in order to be an activist on an issue that matters to us. And then these are some things that you can see again. Am I going the wrong way? There we go. So these were some quotes that I have, and I like the idea that every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And I know that may sound a little bit superficial. I don't think it really is. It's really the idea that when it comes to climate action, you can think about what you're capable of doing, what you have the time and interest and energy to do. But I also want to introduce you to Wangari Maathai, because just as I have a hero in my youth, I have a hero in my later years. Wangari Maathai was the first woman to earn a PhD from an East African nation. She founded something called the Greenbelt Movement, and by the way, for those of you who wonder how I deal with my carbon footprint, with the approval of my wonderful spouse, we give money to the Greenbelt Movement, don't we, Jane? I think we do. Yeah, we do. We give money to the Greenbelt Movement, founded by Wangari Maathai, where she taught women in rural Kenya to plant trees. And now this is a movement all over the world. She also served in the parliament, and I had the good fortune to have lunch with her in 2009, just prior to the Copenhagen Climate Conference. And I was so impressed with her. And what I want to share with you, she also won the Nobel Peace Prize, obviously. And you can see that I like this comment, when we plant trees, we plant the seeds of peace and hope. So as you think about the human dimensions of climate change, think about the people who might be your role models or your heroes. Oops. And I want to end with this, in particular with my friend Salim Hook. These are some quotes from some people I've met at the UN Climate Conference. And one of the people I met and got to spend a lot of time with, and sadly he passed away this last year, is Professor Salim Hook from Independent University, Bangladesh. He was the one who invited me to come to a conference in 2017 and be one of the speakers. And you can see that statement at the end, with the right support and resources, communities on the front lines of climate change can be the most innovative in finding adaptation solutions. And I would add to address just transition, and I would add to certainly develop resilience. So I want to add that it's important to focus on the how and build capacity for transition, adaptation, and resilience by emphasizing human dimensions. Now, this has not been a research talk. For all of you in 114, it's been an advocacy talk. And you're all about to do argument advocacy speeches, aren't you? Yeah, there we go. And what you want to do is advance the thesis. And when you come away from this talk, you think, what was the central point of Walker's message? And you could say it's multifaceted, but it certainly is. We have to be concerned about the climate crisis. There's plenty of great literature on climate science. There's a strong consensus on climate science. But we need to also pay attention to the social science, to the human dimensions. And we need to consider in our own lives, in what form can we act to address this situation in a productive way that is not just for our current generations, but our generations to come. Well, I thank you. I don't know how much time it is. Oh, I did pretty well. Didn't want to go too long. Would you like me to go longer? I'm happy to. Just kidding. Thank you.